Hello and welcome to another edition of All Things Dairy. I'm Jim Carper, editor of Dairy Foods. What cheese do you sprinkle on top of your spaghetti? Parmesan, right? Well, maybe not. The European Union is insisting that only Parmesan cheese made in Italy can be called Parmesan. And that's causing ripples throughout the world because cheesemakers here in the United States who want to export their Parmesan cheeses would be prohibited from using that name. At issue is a concept called geographical indication, or GI for short. Beth Hughes is the Director of International Affairs for the International Dairy Foods Association in Washington, D.C. In her Rules and Regs column for Dairy Foods, Beth wrote about GIs and what they mean to cheesemakers here in the United States. She's going to help me sort out what's at stake for the U.S. dairy industry. Welcome to the program, Beth.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for having me.
First, give me an example of a geographical indication and tell me who decides on how they can be used.
A geographical indication is a form of intellectual property. So I like to use the World Intellectual Properties Organization's definition, which is a sign used on products that have a specific geographical origin and possess qualities or reputation that are due to that origin. Parmigiano Reggiano is a great example of a legitimate GI. This type of cheese can only be produced in the Parma and Reggio regions of Italy. A group of Italian producers registered this GI through the European Commission and hold the exclusive right to use the name and market their product as such in the EU. They also register their name as a trademark in the United States. Each country has its own mechanism for protecting intellectual property. Examples of geographical indications from the United States include Florida for oranges, Idaho for potatoes, and Washington State for apples.
Generally, the U.S. dairy industry opposes geographical indications, right? Why is that?
Actually, the U.S. dairy industry does support legitimate GIs. We do take issue with the European Union's approach to monopolize names that have been deemed generic. To go back to the Parmigiano Reggiano example, we agree that the term in its entirety deserves protection, but the term Parmesan is generic and therefore should not be protected, and use of that term should not be restricted.
How can GIs interfere with U.S. exports and the U.S. domestic market?
Well, when the scope of protection for a particular GI extends to generic terms, it prohibits U.S. dairy exporters from selling and marketing their product in that country. Market share or entire markets can be disrupted or lost. As for the U.S. domestic market, under the current trade negotiations between the U.S. and the EU is actively looking to place restrictions on U.S. dairy companies from using generic terms like Parmesan and Feta. Some of our cheesemakers have been making these products for generations. They created markets and tastes for particular kinds and styles of cheese in the U.S.
Beth, can Congress provide any relief?
Yes, and Congress has been very helpful. Last month and this month, the Senate and House of Representatives passed Trade Promotion Authority. That's a bill that creates negotiating objectives for trade agreements. And one of those objectives prevents the U.S. from negotiating agreements that use GIs to undermine market access. It also seeks protection for generic terms. I'd also like to point out that last year, the Senate and House sent letters to the Obama administration rejecting any proposal on GIs that would restrict the use of generic terms in the trade agreement the U.S. is currently negotiating with the EU.
What actions can U.S. cheesemakers take?
Although it's costly and burdensome, we encourage U.S. companies to register trademarks in countries they currently export to and ones they might export to in the future. We hope this will make it more difficult for GIs that seek protection for generic terms to be approved.
Beth, thanks for shedding some light on the subject of GIs and international trade. You can read Beth's column about this issue at dairyfoods.com. That's it for this edition of All Things Dairy. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+, and keep up to date on all things dairy at dairyfoods.com.